Okay, Psych 250 students, are you ready for Chapter 3? Ooh, there's a long title here. Research, Assessment, Classification of Abnormal Behavior. Is it true we judge a book by its cover? Right? We seem to do that all the time. Or perhaps you see a person and the way they're dressed tells you a lot about their personality. Hmm? Well, in this chapter, we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts and how we classify and identify and try to help figure out the puzzle, because life is a puzzle. People are a puzzle, and we have to figure out where the pieces go sometimes. Now, here's a couple cartoonists here. Roger doesn't use the left side of his brain or the right, he just uses the middle, right? Trying to analyze behavior as to why people behave the way they do. They're taking a biological perspective there. Here's the artist is assuming you know who Herman Rorschach is, right? There he is working on the Rorschach ink blot test, which is a form of a projective test. Before we get into the different types of tests, let's talk about the scientific method. Now, you encountered the scientific method very early in your education, right? Gathering data, formulating a hypothesis, and then testing out, see if you can formulate a theory. And the important thing about your experimentation is, can you replicate it, right? Was it just a fluke? I did an experiment one time. I was in college and I thought, okay, my theory is, or my hypothesis is, the more alcohol you drink, the worse your typing speed gets. So I stayed up late, drinking some wine, testing my typing skills, and it went different than I expected. My speed actually increased the more I consumed alcohol. That was one test. I'm sure if I tried to replicate it, it wouldn't necessarily come out in the same fashion. So this is very important. You have all kinds of experiments these days saying, well, this will lead to this and so forth. And if you just do this, because this experiment I did with a few people, well, let's try to replicate the study. See if other scientists under similar conditions can do the same thing. Because what happens is sometimes things just weird, sometimes there's some unconscious bias, sometimes there's just outright fraud involved in manipulation of data. So we have to trust science. We have to have scientists look at this very carefully. This involves testing. This involves gathering information when it comes to people in the form of a case study. Now you notice throughout the first 3 chapters, and of course in the remaining chapters, you're going to hear a lot about case studies. These are stories of people. And sometimes people ask me, are these stories a lot of information about one person? Are there any of them true? I said, they're all true. Now, I will alter information about certain aspects of the story, but they're all true, right? The reason I alter information is to protect the identity of the person, of course, alive or deceased. Now, if we're not happy with case studies, gathering information, people ask, well, why should I do a case study? That's good for that person, but not necessarily for the next person. But there may be similar details that might be able to help that other person, right? For example, if I encounter a wolf man who claims that the moon turns him into a wolf man, and I gather that data, the next time I have a different wolf man come in, the information from the first case might help the second. These look like twins, almost, right? You see my point? We could also choose to do correlational studies. A typical correlational remark I hear all the time is, the full moon causes people to go crazy. That's where we get the term lunatic, la luna. Well, guess what? They've done research on the full moon and aberrant behavior, and they found basically, they charted it to look something like this. There's no relationship whatsoever. Now, if you're going to get a positive relationship, I'll give an example of a positive relationship. The more you study, the better your grades get. All right, that's a positive correlation. But is that always true? No, it's not always true. The more TV you watch, the worse your grades get. Now, generally that's true, but is it always true? No, because you might be watching some educational programs that have to deal with psychology. It has to deal with stuff we're learning in our chapter. It may actually improve your grades. So be careful of correlational studies. Sometimes they're a little bit tricky in how people present them. And of course, anytime you have advertisers or elections going on, you have people always giving you poll information, correlational studies, just random facts that aren't necessarily facts. So you have to dig a little bit deeper. And so as a scientist, you must do that. Now, if you choose to do an experiment, and if you take our experimental class, you're going to be doing experiments in our psychology lab. They have to be done properly, right? You have to make sure that you have a good operational definition. You have to define your variables very carefully. You have to research them very carefully. You have to decide upon an independent variable and a dependent variable, or multiples. You have to decide which the experimental group is and what the control group is. That way you can do a little comparison. The experimental group gets the independent variable done with it, and the control group doesn't. And you always have, if you can, have a placebo group. Now, this is easier said than done because you have to have a lot of people to do that. But good experiments are set up that way. Okay, so I have this medication that is going to cure a particular illness. I'm going to give the medication to the experimental group. I'm going to get a placebo to the placebo group. And I'm not going to give anything to the control group and see who gets better. Ah, my experimental group gets better. Voila! I found a cure. Well, we have to make sure that there's no bias set up. So we might want to do a double-blind study. In other words, the people in the group do not know if they're actually getting the real medication. And guess what? The experimenter doesn't know if they're actually dispensing the real medication. Now, somebody does know, but not the people in the experiment, the experimenter or the subjects. That way you reduce any kind of bias. If I know I'm giving you real medication, I'm going to give you like that. And if I know you're not, I was like, oh, good luck. We don't want that to affect the results. Now, when it comes to experiments or testing, are they reliable? In other words, do they yield consistent results? If I give you exam 1 and you score fairly well on chapter 3, will you score fairly well next time? If you retake the class, hopefully you won't. Well, if it's a reliable test, you should. In experiments, you want to make sure that people are examining this variable. Different people are examining it. So I don't have my setup bias that's influencing how I perceive the information. Is the assessment valid? On exam 1, if I give you geometry problems, that's not a valid test. I'm giving you questions related directly to chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's a valid test. It's measuring your knowledge of these assigned chapters and abnormal psychology. Is the test given in a standardized way? One class I give a week to do the exam. The other class I give 24 hours. That's not standardized. They should all be given the exam and the same amount of time approximately to conduct the exam. That's standardization. That happens with testing, that happens with experiments, etc. Now, when it comes to personality tests, for example, we have two major categories. One of them is the projective types of tests, and then there's the self-report inventories. Now, some of the projective tests that we're going to go over, at least some of them you'll be exposed to, are things like the Rorschach assessment, or ink blots as we like to know them, the thematic apperception test, sentence completion test, draw a person test. So let me show you some examples of projective tests. Now, why are they called projective? Now, if you go back to our defense mechanisms from the previous chapter, if you remember the idea of projection, right, taking stuff that's inside and projecting onto somebody else. Well, projective tests hope that we do this, right? We either show you images or you create images, and we ask you what's going on. Sometimes we ask you past, present, future, and feelings associated with the image. And we want you to hopefully project what's inside of you onto the ambiguous stimuli. But does it always work? No. But it's a tool, and tools don't always work, right? So one assessment I want to show you is the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test. Now with the TAT, you have cards that show you a picture. And here's an example of picture. And what we do is we show this to the individual and we ask them, what has happened past? What is going on present? What will happen future? What's the feeling associated with the card? And we're looking for themes. We're looking to see what people reveal by looking at these particular images. Is there anything that pops out? That's why it's called thematic. So we can get a pattern of responses, potentially, that might be very informative, right? What are some other projective tests? Well, I mentioned the Rorschach ink blot test. That's what the other shell looks like. Herman Rorschach put these together. And these ones I didn't have as much success with when I was a practitioner doing this assessment. So we would show this ink blot and say, okay, tell me what you see. And of course, creative, very verbal people, they see all kinds of incredible things in these images. They just can go on and on and on. Some people are very restrictive in what they see. They'll just say things like, I see a bunch of ink. And they don't necessarily want to reveal too much about what they see because they may feel that they're going to be perceived in a certain way, which tells us a little bit about that person. Check out this one. This one's called the Senior Apperception Test. It's like the Thematic Apperception Test, but it's geared for older individuals. So here you would do the same thing. We ask them what has happened, what's going on, what will happen, what's the feeling associated. And of course, we would limit this to senior aged individuals. We'll show them this image right here. Ask for their impressions. This one's one of my favorites because usually after I show this image, people have to go and call their grandmother or their mother up. They haven't called. Some people say, why are all the cards so sad? Well, they're not all sad, but some of us perceive them as sad, which tells us a little bit about what's going on inside of us, so to speak. Right? And of course, if we're going to have senior, then we're going to have children's apperception test. Now, there's a couple of different versions of children's apperception test. There's the human version and the animal version. I happen to have the animal version. And kids are quite open and they love storytelling, and so they're open to sharing what they see, right? And again, we're looking for patterns of responses. Sometimes they're very informative, sometimes not. So we're going to continue with assessments, projectives, and self-report inventories next time. Thank you.